The summer air in Atlanta had always carried a pulse of possibility, and for Elena Hayes, it once mirrored the pace of her own life. At 27, she was the youngest assistant director in her company, a rising star with a sharp mind and a sharper ambition. She worked late nights, drafting strategies, led meetings with confidence that belied her age, and dreamed of the day she would launch her own real estate firm. The future, she believed, was hers to shape. That belief shattered one April morning. A blinding headache struck her at her desk, followed by the sensation that her body no longer belonged to her. The next thing she remembered was waking up in a hospital room, fluorescent lights humming overhead, a doctor explaining gently that she had suffered a stroke. The prognosis was uncertain. She might never walk again. Speech might return, or it might not. In an instant, the woman who had once commanded boardrooms was confined to a wheelchair, struggling to form even simple words. At first, Elena told herself she could rebuild. She had Ryan. They had been married for 3 years, and though his quiet nature often clashed with her drive, she believed their love would carry them through anything. But as the weeks turned into months, she began to see the distance growing in his eyes. His visits to the hospital became shorter, his patience thinner. He stopped talking about their future and instead sighed when the medical bills arrived. The real fracture came from Victoria, Ryan's mother. A retired stage actress with a flair for cruelty, Victoria had never approved of Elena, dismissing her as too ambitious and not the homemaker type. Now, she seized on Elena's condition as proof of what she had always said. "She's a burden, Ryan," Victoria hissed one evening in the hospital room, unaware Elena was awake and listening. "The doctors said she may not live more than a year. Do you really want to spend that year wiping drool and pushing a chair? Send her back to that little house in the country. Let her die where she grew up." Ryan didn't respond immediately. He stared at his hands, jaw clenched, as if the decision weighed on him. But Elena saw the subtle nod he gave. It was small, almost imperceptible, but enough to make her heart seize. Weeks later, Ryan announced he had a plan. They would leave Atlanta behind. He had arranged for Elena to be moved to the small house she had inherited from her grandmother, a modest, weather-worn place on the outskirts of a rural town near Athens, Georgia. He assured her it was for her peace and comfort. He would visit often, he promised. He even hired a local woman, Galina, to help around the house. But the truth lay heavy beneath his words. He was sending her away. The move happened in late autumn. The leaves had just begun to turn when Ryan wheeled Elena into the back of his SUV. She said nothing, she couldn't, but her silence was not acceptance. It was disbelief. The drive was long, winding through roads that grew narrower and emptier with each passing mile, until the skyline of Atlanta was nothing but a memory. When they arrived, the sight of the house nearly broke her. The paint peeled from its siding, the shutters hung crooked, and weeds had swallowed the once neat garden. Inside, the air smelled stale and abandoned. "It's only temporary," Ryan said, his tone distant. "Galina will take care of you. I'll come as soon as I can." Galina appeared a few hours later, her breath heavy with the sour scent of whiskey. She nodded curtly at Elena and shuffled off to the kitchen, muttering under her breath. This was the woman Ryan had entrusted with her care. That night, Ryan packed the last of his things into the car. He kissed Elena's forehead, an empty, obligatory gesture, and walked toward the door. He paused for a moment, his hand on the knob, as if summoning the courage to look back. But he didn't. The engine started, gravel crunched beneath the tires, and the red glow of his taillights disappeared down the road. Elena sat in the silence that followed, the weight of betrayal pressing down harder than any physical paralysis. That night, under the dim light of a single lamp, she realized the truth. Ryan had not just left her in a forgotten corner of Georgia. He had abandoned her. And though she could not yet speak the words aloud, the thought echoed clearly in her mind. This was only the beginning. Almost a year slipped by without a single visit. Ryan had buried himself in work and distractions, telling himself there was no need to check on Elena so soon. She was being taken care of, after all, and the whole arrangement had been for her comfort. But deep down, he knew the truth he was avoiding her. He didn't want to see what he had done. He didn't want to confront the guilt. Victoria, however, had no patience for his avoidance. One Sunday afternoon, as they sat in her polished living room sipping tea, she slammed her cup onto the table with a sharp clink. "You haven't even gone back once," she demanded. "For all you know, the girl might be dead already." Ryan shifted uncomfortably. Galena would have called. "Galena." Victoria scoffed. "That useless drunk? She probably drank herself into a ditch. Ryan, you need to go and check. If she's gone, we need to know. And if she's still alive." She let the sentence trail off, a faint curl of disdain tugging at her lips. The following weekend, Ryan finally gave in. Guilt, irritation, and curiosity swirled in equal measure as he drove the familiar road out of Atlanta. The further he went, the more uneasy he felt. When he turned onto the gravel path leading to the small house, his unease deepened into confusion. The place looked abandoned. The grass in the yard was knee-high, weeds climbing up the porch steps. The shutters hung loosely, creaking in the breeze. He stepped out of the car and tried the front door. Locked. He knocked. No answer. "Galena!" he called out, his voice breaking the eerie silence. A neighbor passing by paused at the sight of him. "Looking for the woman in the wheelchair?" the man asked, adjusting the strap of a feed sack over his shoulder. "Yes. Elena Hayes. Do you know where she is?" The man shrugged. "Haven't seen her for months. The woman who used to come here. Drank like a fish. She stopped showing up too. Word is the lady moved. No one knows where." Ryan felt his chest tighten. Moved? How? She couldn't even walk. And why hadn't Galena contacted him? Panic began to simmer beneath his skin. He started asking questions at the small store, the post office, the gas station. No one had seen Elena in months, but a woman at the bakery offered a clue. "Someone said they saw her at that new estate just outside town," she said. "You know, the big property with the iron gates and the rose garden. It's the only mansion around here. Hard to miss." It was impossible. Ryan knew Elena didn't have the means to live in a place like that. And yet, half an hour later, he found himself standing before tall, wrought iron gates, staring at a sprawling estate surrounded by meticulously trimmed hedges and rows of blooming roses. The gravel driveway wound gracefully up to a white, two-story house with wide verandas and tall windows gleaming in the afternoon sun. His hands trembled slightly as he pressed the call button. A chime echoed faintly from within, and then a voice answered through the intercom. Calm, steady, unmistakable. "Who is it?" Ryan's breath caught in his throat. It was Elena, not the slurred, broken speech of a stroke patient, but clear and confident. "Elena, it's me," he managed to say. A long pause. Then, "Come in." The gates swung open slowly, and Ryan drove down the curved path, his heart pounding. The door opened before he could knock, and there she was. Elena stood in the doorway in a soft linen dress, sunlight catching the auburn highlights in her hair. She wasn't sitting in a wheelchair. She wasn't frail or broken. She was standing, tall, poised, and breathtakingly alive. "Hello, Ryan," she said, her voice cool but steady. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The woman before him looked nothing like the fragile patient he had abandoned a year ago. "Would you like to come in?" she asked, stepping aside. Her tone was polite, almost casual, but her eyes held a sharpness that made his stomach twist. As he crossed the threshold into the elegant, sunlit foyer, Elena turned to face him fully. "You didn't expect this, did you?" she said softly, a faint smile ghosting her lips. Then, leaning just slightly closer, she added, "You didn't think I'd still be alive." Ryan stood in stunned silence in the entryway of the grand house, but Elena didn't rush to fill it. She let him stand there, let the weight of the moment press against his chest. Then, with a measured calm, she turned and gestured toward the sitting room. Come, there's something you should understand, she said. As Ryan followed her into the sunlit space, the scent of roses drifted through the open windows. Every detail of the room, the polished floors, the paintings on the walls, the delicate porcelain teacups on the table, felt like a deliberate declaration. She had built a life without him, and it was better than the one they had shared. She poured tea into 2 cups and placed one in front of him, though she knew he wouldn't drink it. Then she sat down across from him, her expression unreadable. Do you remember, she began, the letter I received about a year before my stroke? Ryan blinked, caught off guard. What letter? My grandmother's will, Elena said, her tone light but laced with steel. She passed in Hamburg. I hadn't seen her since I was a teenager, but she never forgot me. She left me a considerable inheritance. Cash, yes, but also shares in a real estate development company. Enough to change our lives. Ryan's pulse quickened. He remembered. At the time, he had thought of it as a miracle. Elena had come home glowing, clutching the documents with trembling hands, her eyes bright with hope. She had told him and Victoria the news over dinner, tears streaking down her cheeks as she laughed through them. And he and his mother, had played their parts perfectly. How could I forget? He said now, forcing a thin smile. We were so happy. Elena let out a low, humorless laugh. We. She shook her head slowly. I thought you were happy for me. That's what I told myself. But now, looking back, her gaze lifted, locking onto his. I see it differently. Her mind drifted back to those early days after the inheritance arrived. Victoria's tone had softened almost overnight. The woman who had once called her unworthy suddenly began stopping by with casseroles and compliments. Ryan, too, had changed. He was attentive again, affectionate even, talking about dreams they might pursue together, trips to Europe, a business they could start. Elena had let herself believe that the worst of their struggles were behind them. Then she found the earring. It was small, gold, and definitely not hers, wedged between the cushions of their living room couch. A pit had opened in her stomach as she stared at it, the metallic glint reflecting a truth she wasn't ready to face. She searched further, receipts from dinners she hadn't been invited to, a faint scent of unfamiliar perfume on his shirts. The denial didn't last long. A few days later, she hired a private investigator. The man was discreet, thorough, and mercilessly efficient. Within a week, he handed her photographs. Ryan in a downtown restaurant with a woman barely out of college, his hand on hers across the table. Then, outside a hotel, his arm draped around her waist. And finally, a recording that shattered what little remained of Elena's illusions. On the tape, Ryan's voice was clear and unmistakable. Once the inheritance clears, I'll have the capital I need. I'll start the company, build it from the ground up. And once everything's running, well, I won't need her anymore. The woman giggled softly. What about her health? She won't last a year, Ryan replied coldly. The doctors said as much. By the time this is all over, it'll be like she never existed. Sitting in the investigator's office, Elena had felt something in her break. All the memories, their first apartment with its peeling paint and second-hand furniture, the nights they'd stayed up dreaming about the future, the sacrifices she had made to support his career, flooded her mind and dissolved into something bitter. She had believed in love, in partnership, in vows spoken under a June sky. And yet here it was, laid bare in a single sentence. To him, she was a stepping stone, a tool, a means to an end. That night, alone in their bedroom, Elena stared at the ceiling and felt the last thread of denial snap. The man she had once trusted with her heart was plotting a future without her. The life they had built was a mirage, and the person beside her had been a stranger all along. It was the darkest chapter of her life. But as the days passed, her grief hardened into something else, something quieter, colder, sharper. She would not confront him. Not yet. Instead, she would let him believe his plan was working. And when the time came, she would let him see just how wrong he had been. Elena didn't tell Ryan she knew. She didn't rage or confront him, didn't demand explanations that would only be met with lies. Instead, she carried her heartbreak to the one person she still trusted, Samantha Reed. They had met in college, back when Elena still believed the world was a fair place, and Samantha had been her anchor through every storm since. She was now a successful attorney, known for her blunt honesty and relentless logic, and when Elena finished recounting every cruel word from the recording, Samantha's face hardened. "He's not just betraying you," Samantha said quietly. "He's building a future on your grave." Elena nodded, her hands trembling as she folded the investigator's report. "I want to know if he'd still do it without the money. If everything he's planning depends on me disappearing." Samantha leaned back in her chair, fingers steepled. "Then we give him the chance to prove it." The plan took weeks to design and even longer to set in motion. Samantha contacted a trusted physician, an old friend from law school who had transitioned into medical administration. For the right fee, and under the pretense of helping Elena avoid harassment from opportunistic relatives, he agreed to prepare a falsified medical report. The document stated that Elena's stroke had caused irreversible damage, that her heart was dangerously weak, and that she was unlikely to live more than a year. It was, as Samantha called it, a test wrapped in the perfect excuse. Elena played her part flawlessly. She practiced keeping her body limp, her hands motionless. She taught herself to sit in silence for hours, resisting the instinct to respond even when spoken to. Her speech had mostly recovered by then, but she deliberately slurred her words or avoided speaking altogether when Ryan was around. To the outside world, she was no longer the vibrant, ambitious woman she once was. She was a ghost, breathing but barely living. And just as Samantha predicted, Ryan and Victoria believed every word of the forged report. Ryan stopped bringing flowers to the hospital. Victoria stopped pretending to care at all. They began having whispered conversations in the hallway about inheritance, about investments, about a future that no longer included Elena. "She'll be gone before the year's out," Victoria said one afternoon, unaware Elena could hear her from the hospital bed. "Then you'll be free. We'll be free." Ryan's answer was a simple, chilling "I know." By the time Elena was discharged, Ryan had already begun rearranging their lives. He suggested they sell the townhouse in Atlanta, claiming it was too big and too expensive for them now. He spoke of simplifying things, of focusing on her comfort in what he called the time she had left. And finally, he proposed what Victoria had wanted all along, that Elena return to the small rural house she had inherited years ago. "It's peaceful there," he said, his voice so carefully rehearsed it almost fooled her. "You'll be happier." Elena agreed without protest. She didn't even flinch when he hired Galina, a local woman with a reputation for drinking more than she worked, to look after her. She let him believe she was too weak to argue. She let him believe she was grateful. And so, one chilly afternoon in October, Ryan loaded her into the back of the SUV and drove her away from everything they had built. He promised he would visit soon. He promised they would talk about the future. Elena said nothing. The house greeted them like a memory she had tried to forget. Peeling paint, sagging porch, weeds swallowing the garden. Ryan carried her inside and helped her into the wheelchair one last time. He kissed her forehead, told her to rest, and left without looking back. Minutes after the car disappeared down the dirt road, Elena exhaled and placed both feet firmly on the wooden floor. Her legs were weak but functional, her balance unsteady but real. Slowly, deliberately, she rose from the wheelchair. Galina, sitting at the kitchen table with a bottle already open, froze mid-sip. You can walk," she stammered. Elena met her wide-eyed stare with calm precision. "I could always walk. You're going to keep that to yourself." Galina's hand trembled as Elena slid an envelope across the table. Inside was more money than the woman had likely seen in her life. "You'll report everything as normal," Elena continued. No changes. No improvements. Nothing. Galina swallowed hard and nodded. No changes, she muttered, clutching the envelope. And with that, Elena turned toward the dusty windows and looked out at the overgrown yard. Ryan thought he had abandoned a dying woman here. He had no idea he had just left behind the beginning of his undoing. The first morning after Ryan left, the house felt like a tomb. Dust clung to every surface, cobwebs draped across forgotten corners, and the air itself seemed stale with the weight of neglect. Elena stood in the doorway of what had once been her grandmother's kitchen and took a long, steady breath. This was where her new life would begin. Not in a high-rise office or a hospital bed, but here, among peeling wallpaper and creaking floorboards. The first days were spent reclaiming the space. At first, Elena's legs trembled with every step, her muscles protesting after months of disuse. But with each passing hour, she grew stronger. She threw open the windows, letting crisp autumn air chase away the staleness. She scrubbed the floors until her knees ached, dragged furniture into sunlight to banish years of dust, and burned sage like her grandmother used to, watching the smoke curl through the empty rooms. By the end of the week, the house no longer felt like a graveyard. It felt like a beginning. Samantha arrived 2 days later, her sharp eyes scanning Elena from head to toe before pulling her into a fierce hug. You look stronger, she said, stepping back. And furious. That's a good sign. I'm done being a victim, Elena replied softly. Over cups of coffee at the kitchen table, they talked about what came next. Elena confessed she had already resigned from her job. That version of me is gone, she said. I don't want the endless deadlines and corporate battles anymore. I want something quieter, something that belongs to me. Samantha nodded. You don't have to figure it all out today. For now, breathe. Live. Let the silence teach you what you actually want. It was strange at first to live without the constant hum of the city. Nights were darker here, the stars startlingly bright. Mornings began not with conference calls, but with bird song and the rustle of leaves. And slowly, Elena began to rediscover small joys she had long forgotten. The smell of rain on soil, the feel of sunlight on her skin, the rhythm of days that belonged entirely to her. One Saturday, she decided to visit the village market. It had been years since she'd walked those narrow aisles lined with stalls selling everything from homemade honey to woven baskets. People stared at first. Many had believed she was gravely ill, perhaps even dead, but their curiosity soon softened into warm greetings. It was there at a produce stand piled high with late-season apples that she first met Jacob Miller. He was older than her by a few years, with broad shoulders and calloused hands, the kind of man who carried the scent of the fields with him. His manner was gruff, his voice deep and clipped, but there was a steadiness in his gaze that disarmed her. Those boxes look heavy, he said, nodding to the crates of apples and potatoes she'd bought. I'll manage, Elena replied, though she knew she couldn't carry them far. Jacob raised an eyebrow. You'll drop them before you get halfway home. He picked up the crates without waiting for permission. Where to? Despite herself, Elena smiled. The old Hayes place. He carried the boxes to the truck parked beside her and loaded them carefully. Haven't seen anyone there in a while, he said as he shut the tailgate. If you need anything, repairs, hauling, anything at all, I'm just down the road. The next morning, Elena heard the rumble of a lawnmower outside. When she stepped onto the porch, there was Jacob, mowing down the sea of weeds that had swallowed the yard. I didn't ask you to do that, she called out over the noise. Didn't say you did, he shouted back. It needed doing. When he finished, sweat darkening the back of his shirt, she invited him in for breakfast. He hesitated, then nodded, wiping his hands on his jeans before stepping into the kitchen. They ate scrambled eggs and toast in companionable silence, broken only by the occasional question about the house, the land, their lives before now. It was a simple meal, yet as they sat across from each other, Elena felt something stir inside her that she hadn't felt in a long time. Trust. Not the naive kind she'd once given freely, but something quieter and more deliberate, born not of promises but of actions. For the first time since the world had collapsed beneath her, Elena allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she thought. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm Elena hadn't known she needed. Every few days, Jacob would appear at her gate without warning, toolbox in hand, sleeves rolled up, as though helping her had been penciled into his calendar all along. One morning, he was fixing the door that refused to close properly. Another afternoon, he was replacing a cracked window pane that had been letting the cold night air seep in. When a section of the old fence collapsed after a storm, he showed up before sunrise and rebuilt it board by board. He never asked for anything in return. When Elena offered money, he waved it off. "You'll insult me if you try," he said simply. At first, she found his constant presence unsettling. It had been so long since someone had shown up without an agenda. But slowly, his visits began to feel less like intrusions and more like something she could count on. His steady hands and quiet determination filled the house with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. They started talking more as they worked side by side. Jacob shared stories from his past, how he had enlisted in the Marine Corps straight out of high school, serving nearly a decade before returning home to take over his father's farm. "Didn't plan on being a farmer," he admitted one afternoon while repairing a broken shutter. "But after Dad passed, it felt right. The land's been in our family for generations. Someone had to keep it alive." Elena listened, fascinated by the way he spoke about the land, not as property, but as a living thing that demanded care and patience. In return, she told him about her old life in Atlanta, the long hours and sharp suits, the ambition that had once burned so fiercely she could barely sleep. She confessed the dream she'd buried deep, to start her own real estate firm, one that prioritized people over profit. "You still could," Jacob said quietly, tightening the final bolt on the shutter. She shook her head. "That part of my life is over." He glanced at her, brow furrowed. "Only if you want it to be." It wasn't a declaration of love or a dramatic speech, just a simple truth offered without expectation. But it lingered with her long after he left that day. What grew between them wasn't marked by grand gestures or whispered confessions. There were no flowers, no candlelit dinners, no sweeping declarations. Instead, it was built on small, consistent acts: a bag of fresh vegetables left on her porch, a repaired hinge, a shared meal after a long day. It was built on presence. And presence, Elena realized, was something she had been starved of for far too long. Then, one afternoon, news spread through the village that Jacob's farm was in trouble. A poor harvest, rising equipment costs, and a supplier who had gone bankrupt had pushed the operation to the brink. He might lose the whole thing, one of the vendors at the market whispered as Elena paid for her groceries. Without hesitating, she drove to his farm. She found him in the barn, hunched over a stack of papers, his expression grim. "I didn't expect you," he said, managing a small smile. "You need help," Elena replied. It wasn't a question. At first, he resisted. Pride, she realized, was as much a part of Jacob as his broad shoulders and sun-weathered hands. But when she asked to see the books, he handed them over with a resigned sigh. What she found made her heart ache. Receipts were scattered and untracked, suppliers had overcharged him, and small errors had snowballed into chaos. "This isn't failure," she told him, flipping through the ledgers. "It's bad accounting." Over the next few weeks, Elena spent hours at his kitchen table, sorting receipts into neat piles and entering numbers into spreadsheets. She renegotiated contracts, canceled unnecessary subscriptions, and built a clear budget plan. Bit by bit, order replaced chaos. And with each late-night session over cups of coffee and stacks of paperwork, the distance between them grew smaller. By the time the books balanced, Jacob's farm was no longer teetering on the edge, and neither were they. They had built something quietly powerful between them, something that didn't need to be named. It wasn't romance, not yet. It was trust, respect, and the comforting knowledge that they were better together than apart. And for Elena, who had once believed she would face the rest of her life alone, that was more than enough. It happened one cool evening as they sat at Jacob's kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of ledgers and receipts they had finally conquered. The sun was dipping below the tree line, painting the fields outside in deep shades of gold and amber. Elena watched the fading light and felt a weight pressing on her chest. Not the heaviness of guilt, but the urgency of truth. "There's something I haven't told you," she said softly, breaking the comfortable silence between them. Jacob looked up from the papers, his brow furrowing slightly. "What is it?" Elena took a deep breath. The stroke, the diagnosis, the wheelchair, not all of it was real. The stroke was real, but the rest. I exaggerated my condition. I let Ryan think I was dying. She paused, searching his face for judgment. I wanted to see what he would do if he thought I was no longer useful to him, and he showed me exactly who he was. For a long moment, Jacob said nothing. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady on her. Then, instead of anger or disapproval, he reached across the table and took her hand in his. His palm was rough and warm, grounding her. "You did what you had to do," he said quietly. "Some people deserve the truth. Others deserve a mirror." The simplicity of his words undid her. She hadn't realized how deeply she feared rejection until that moment, and how much his quiet acceptance meant. Days turned into weeks, and as autumn gave way to winter, their work continued. The farm grew more stable with each passing day, and Elena began to notice a spark in Jacob's eyes whenever he spoke about the future. One afternoon, after loading the truck with feed, he asked her to take a drive with him. "Where are we going?" she asked as they turned off the main road and down a winding lane. "You'll see," he replied, a faint smile tugging at his lips. They pulled up before a sprawling, weathered estate set back behind a wrought iron gate. The house was large, too large, Elena thought, for a single family, with broad verandas, high windows, and a view that stretched for miles. Though the paint was faded and the grounds overgrown, there was an undeniable dignity to it, as if it were waiting to be brought back to life. "This is it," Jacob said, stepping out of the truck and looking at the house with something like reverence. "This place has been on the market for over a year. Too big, too expensive for anyone around here. But I've had a dream for a long time to turn it into a model farm, a place where people can learn, where we can grow more than crops, something that matters." Elena walked slowly toward the house, her fingers brushing the cool iron of the gate. In another life, she might have seen only the cost, the logistics, the risk. But now she saw possibility. She saw roots. "How much?" she asked. Jacob hesitated. "Too much for me. I've run the numbers 100 times. It's out of reach." She turned to him, the decision forming in her chest before she could second-guess it. "Not for us." He frowned. "Elena, I have the inheritance," she said firmly. "It's more than enough. And I don't want it sitting in some account while I hide from the world. I want to build something real, something with you." For once, Jacob was speechless. He stared at her as if trying to memorize every word, every detail of this moment. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his face, not the polite smile she had seen before, but something deeper, warmer. "Elena," he said quietly, stepping closer, "are you sure?" She nodded, her heart beating hard against her ribs. "I've never been more sure of anything." Silence settled between them, soft and electric. And then, with the winter wind curling around them and the empty house standing like a promise in the distance, she said the words she had been holding back for months. "I love you, Jacob." His breath caught. For a man who had always chosen his words carefully, his answer was beautifully simple. "I love you too." There were no grand gestures, no cinematic kiss beneath the fading sun. Just two people standing side by side, dreaming the same dream. And in that moment, Elena knew that the life she was building, the life born from ruin and betrayal, was finally hers to claim. Together, they would restore the old estate. Together, they would build the model farm. Together, they would start again, not as broken pieces trying to fit back into the past, but as partners stepping into a future that, for the first time, felt entirely their own. Ryan sat stiffly on the edge of the velvet armchair, the porcelain teacup in front of him untouched. His eyes darted around the sunlit room, taking in the details, the antique furniture, the polished floors, the shelves lined with books and framed photographs. None of it made sense. A year ago, he had left Elena in a crumbling farmhouse with nothing but a bottle-soaked caretaker and a prognosis that promised the end. And now, here she was, walking, speaking, thriving, in a home more beautiful than anything they had ever shared. Elena watched him from across the room, her posture composed, her gaze steady. "I suppose you want to know how all of this happened," she said, breaking the silence. Ryan swallowed hard, his voice low. "I don't understand. The doctors, they said that I wouldn't live a year." Elena's smile was cold. "Yes, they did, because that's what we wanted them to say. We." His brows knitted. Before she could answer, the sound of heels clicked against the hardwood floor, and Samantha appeared in the doorway, a folder tucked under her arm. "Hello, Ryan," she said with a lawyer's practiced calm. "It's been a while." Ryan's confusion deepened. You were part of this." Samantha set the folder on the table and took a seat beside Elena. "I was the one who arranged for the medical report," she said matter-of-factly. "Completely legal? No. But necessary? Absolutely. We needed to see who you really were when you thought Elena was dying. And you didn't disappoint." The blood drained from Ryan's face. "You tricked me." Elena let out a soft, bitter laugh. "No, Ryan. You exposed yourself. I didn't make you lie. I didn't make you cheat. I didn't make you plan a future with someone else before I was even gone. That was all you." At the mention of cheating, his gaze dropped to the floor. Elena tilted her head, her tone sharpened. "How is she, by the way? The girl who was worth throwing away a marriage for?" Ryan's jaw tightened. "It's over." "I'm not surprised," Elena replied coolly. "Most people lose interest when the money never arrives. I imagine she got tired of waiting for you to inherit a fortune you were never going to see." The jab landed, and for a moment, Ryan looked like he might lash out. But instead, he straightened in his chair, clinging to the one piece of leverage he thought he had left. "It doesn't matter," he said, trying to steady his voice. "You bought this house, you built this life, all while we were still married. Under Georgia law, that makes it marital property. Half of it belongs to me." Samantha leaned back and crossed her legs, her expression a study in patient amusement. "Actually, that's not how it works," she said. "Property acquired through inheritance is considered separate, not marital, unless it's deliberately commingled. Elena didn't use joint funds. She didn't add your name to anything. Every dollar she spent came from money she inherited and money she controlled." Ryan blinked, the words not sinking in fast enough. "But furthermore," Samantha continued smoothly, "any profit generated by investments she made after you abandoned her is hers alone. You walked away, Ryan. You left her to die in a house you didn't even bother to maintain. A court isn't going to reward you for that." The silence that followed was suffocating. Ryan shifted in his seat, his hands tightening into fists. "You can't do this," he muttered, though even he didn't sound convinced. "Oh, but I already did," Elena said, her voice soft but lethal. At that moment, footsteps sounded from the hallway, and Jacob appeared, wiping his hands on a rag as he stepped into the room. His presence filled the space, broad-shouldered, steady, calm in a way that made Ryan visibly tense. "Is everything all right?" Jacob asked, his gaze never leaving Ryan. "It's fine," Elena said lightly. "We're just finishing up." Ryan stood, trying to summon the indignation he no longer felt. "And you are," he demanded. Jacob's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. The man who makes sure she never has to deal with people like you again. He took a slow step closer, his voice dropping into a low, steady warning. If you think about harassing her, suing her, threatening her in any way, don't. Ryan swallowed. Or what? Jacob leaned in just enough for Ryan to feel the weight behind his words. Or I will make sure you regret it for the rest of your life. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Ryan's shoulders slumped. The fight drained out of him, leaving only the hollow echo of defeat. He muttered something about speaking to his lawyer, though they all knew it was pointless, and walked toward the door. As it closed behind him, the house seemed to exhale. Samantha let out a long breath and exchanged a glance with Elena, who sat silently, her expression unreadable. It wasn't triumph she felt, not yet. But as she turned toward the window and watched Ryan's car disappear down the road, she realized that for the first time since her life had collapsed, the balance had shifted. She was no longer the woman he had left behind. She was the woman he would never be able to touch again. Ryan returned a week later, but this time not to plead or posture. He arrived with a lawyer and a stack of papers, his face set in the rigid mask of a man clinging to the last scraps of control. Elena wasn't surprised. She had expected this part. They met in her lawyer's office, a sterile room with beige walls and soft lighting that felt far too calm for the tension inside it. Ryan sat across from her, his posture stiff, his hands folded tightly in front of him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Elena broke the silence. I'm filing for divorce tomorrow. Ryan's head jerked up, as if the words had struck him physically. Tomorrow. Yes, she said evenly. There's nothing left to discuss. There's nothing left between us. I don't want your apology, and I don't want revenge in the way you think I do. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze locking with his. All I want is to see the look on your face when you realize you lost everything. Not because I took it, but because you threw it away. Ryan's jaw tightened. I'm still your husband, and everything you've bought since your inheritance came as marital property. That house, that farm, the business, half of it belongs to me. You'll see me in court. She almost smiled. I'm counting on it. And so he took her to court. The hearing began 3 weeks later in a small county courthouse. Reporters didn't care about it, and neighbors didn't gossip. To the world, it was just another divorce. But for Ryan, it was supposed to be the moment he reclaimed control. He strode into the courtroom with his attorney, confident that the law was on his side. For months, he had been telling himself the same story, that Elena's fortune had become part of their shared estate the moment it was spent. That anything purchased while they were still legally married, the land, the farmhouse, even the renovations, would be split evenly. But Samantha was ready. She walked the judge through every detail with surgical precision. The bank transfers showing that Elena's inheritance had remained in a separate account, untouched by marital funds. The invoices proving that all renovations and investments had been made after Ryan abandoned her. The documentation showing that income from the farm was the result of new business activities established after their separation. Georgia law is very clear, Samantha concluded. Inherited property remains separate unless it is deliberately commingled. Mr. Hayes did not contribute to these purchases. He did not invest in the farm. He did not share in its risks or its labor. He left my client to fend for herself, and she did with her own resources. Ryan's lawyer tried to push back, arguing that their marriage had not yet been legally dissolved when the purchases were made. But the judge wasn't swayed. The court recognizes the funds as separate property, she ruled. Furthermore, income derived from investments made after physical and financial separation is not subject to equitable division. The words landed like a hammer. Ryan's shoulders slumped, his face drained of color. All his confident talk, all his threats gone. And the blows kept coming. His claim to the new farmhouse? Denied. His demand for half of the profits from the agricultural venture? Rejected. Even the desperate motion to place a lien on future income from the land was dismissed. When the final ruling was read, Ryan was left with nothing but the clothes he wore and the debts he had accumulated. The inheritance he had once counted on was forever out of reach. Outside the courthouse, the winter wind cut through his thin coat as he stood alone on the steps. Reporters weren't there, but a handful of locals were, and Ryan caught fragments of their whispers. Words like karma and deserved floated on the breeze. Victoria was waiting for him by the curb, her face pale and drawn. She had been silent throughout the proceedings, but now she spoke, her voice brittle. "You promised we'd be taken care of." Ryan didn't answer. There was nothing to say. His mother's hopes of inheriting Elena's fortune had vanished along with his. Across the street, Elena emerged from the courthouse, flanked by Samantha and Jacob. She paused at the top of the steps and looked at Ryan, not with hatred, not even with anger, but with something far more devastating: indifference. She had wanted this moment, not the legal victory, not the money, not even the freedom. Just this, to watch Ryan understand that the life he had gambled on was gone forever. And as he turned away, empty-handed and hollow-eyed, Elena felt the weight of years lift from her shoulders. It wasn't vengeance in the dramatic sense. It was quieter, sharper, justice delivered without raising her voice. Ryan had built his plans on her suffering. Now he would live the rest of his life in the ruins of those plans. The seasons turned, and with them, Elena's life unfolded into something she had once believed was no longer possible. The old estate that Jacob had shown her, once empty and forgotten, was now alive with purpose. Fields that had been overgrown and abandoned bloomed under their care. Rows of crops stretching toward the horizon like a promise kept. The farmhouse, once weathered and gray, had been restored into a home filled with warmth and laughter. It wasn't easy. There were long days and sleepless nights, setbacks that tested their resolve and storms that battered their land. But every challenge met and overcome knit them closer together. They learned to lean on each other, to build not just a farm but a partnership, one grounded in trust, respect, and quiet resilience. The farm grew beyond their expectations. Soon, families from across Georgia came to visit, students from the local university volunteered for seasonal work, and agricultural journals wrote about their sustainable practices. Jacob's dream of creating a model farm had become a reality, and Elena had played a vital role in making it happen. But she didn't stop there. With Samantha's legal expertise and Jacob's unwavering support, Elena finally revived the dream she had once buried beneath heartbreak: her own business. She launched a boutique real estate consultancy focused on helping rural landowners revitalize their properties. It was small at first, just her and a laptop in a spare room above the barn, but word spread quickly. Clients trusted her because she didn't just understand the numbers. She understood the weight of starting over. Her company thrived, growing from a one-woman operation into a respected firm. And for Elena, every deal signed and every property restored was more than business. It was a reclamation of the life that had once been stolen from her. One late summer evening, as the sun melted into the rolling hills and painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, Elena stood on the porch of their farmhouse and looked out over the land. The field swayed gently in the breeze. The air carried the scent of earth and hay, and somewhere in the distance, Jacob was calling to the farmhands, his deep voice carrying easily across the open space. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the peace of the scene settle over her. A year ago, she had been left to die, discarded, betrayed, forgotten. Now, she was stronger than she had ever been. Jacob joined her on the porch, slipping an arm around her waist. "Penny for your thoughts," he murmured. She smiled, leaning into him. "Just thinking about how far we've come." He kissed her temple, and how much further we'll go. Together, they watched the sun sink below the horizon, the last light glinting off the farmhouse windows. Elena's heart was full, not just with love for the man beside her, but with pride in the woman she had become. She was no longer the victim of someone else's cruelty. She was no longer defined by betrayal or loss. She was a survivor, a builder, a dreamer, and above all, she was free. Somewhere out there, Ryan was still grappling with the consequences of his choices. But Elena no longer cared. His story had ended where hers had begun, and in the quiet hum of the evening, as crickets began to sing and the first stars appeared, she understood a truth that had taken her a lifetime to learn. Sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't ruin or retribution. Sometimes it's living a life so full, so joyful, so utterly beyond what they ever believed you could, that their betrayal no longer matters at all. And as the last light faded from the Georgia sky, Elena Hayes, survivor, businesswoman, and builder of dreams, smiled into the dusk, knowing that her best chapters were only just beginning.